Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a really deep look at the engine that drives every single thing we do, the muscular system.
It's an incredible topic.
It really is. I mean, it's almost impossible to overstate its importance. We think about the big stuff, walking, talking. But it's also circulating our blood, digesting our food. Without it, we're just stationary.
It's a beautifully complex system, and I think most people only really consider those big voluntary muscles, your biceps, your quads.
Right.
But understanding how these tissues get that immense force and fine control, well, that means we have to dive right down to the cellular level.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to systematically unpack the anatomy, the micromechanics, everything, focusing on skeletal muscle, the ones we control. We're going straight to the academic sources you've brought to see how they function and what's really happening every time you decide to, just move.
To start, it's probably best to recognize the fundamental capabilities that all muscle tissues, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth, they all have to have these to function. We can really boil it down to 4 core properties.
And these are the things that make muscle. Well, muscle, different from bone or skin.
Exactly. First is excitability, which means the tissue can respond to an outside stimulus.
Like a nerve signal.
Primarily signals from the nervous system or sometimes hormones. Second, and this is maybe the most defining feature, is contractility. The ability to actively shorten and exert a pull, a tension. They don't just sit there, they actively pull.
That pull is everything.
Third is extensibility. This means the muscle can be stretched, beyond its resting length.
Like stretching before you exercise.
Precisely, and it can still contract when the signal arrives. And finally, there's elasticity. It's the ability to rebound, to just snap back to its original length after it contracts, a kind of biological recoil.
Okay, so let's narrow in on skeletal muscle specifically. Beyond just moving us around, they have a few other really critical jobs. Our sources list 5 key roles, and the first one is the obvious one, producing skeletal movement.
Right. The second one is maintaining posture. Even as you're sitting here listening, your core and back muscles are constantly firing just a little to stabilize your joints and keep your head up. It's subtle, but it's nonstop work.
Third, they support soft tissues. The abdominal wall, the pelvic floor, they're basically a muscular cradle holding our organs in. Fourth, they regulate material entry and exit.
You mean like sphincters?
Exactly. Those muscular rings give us voluntary control over the urinary and digestive tracts.
And the fifth role is absolutely crucial for survival, maintaining body temperature. Muscle contraction uses a ton of energy, and when you burn energy, a lot of it is lost as heat.
Which is why we shiver when we're cold.
Yes, shivering is just rapid, involuntary muscle contractions. The whole point is just to generate heat and keep your core temperature where it needs to be.
That's a great way to think about it. Okay, let's unpack the structure. If you picture a big power cable, you can kind of visualize how a muscle is organized. It's all about these layers of connective tissue wrappings.
We start on the very outside with the epimysium. This is a dense, tough layer that wraps the entire muscle, separating it from everything else around it.
And if we cut through that,
we find the perimysium. This layer divides the muscle into compartments. And inside each of those compartments, you find a bundle of muscle fibers called a fascicle. This is also where the main blood vessels and nerves run.
So it's like a bundle of wires inside the big cable.
A perfect analogy. And then wrapped around every single one of those individual wires, every single muscle fiber, is the most delicate layer, the endomysium. It supports the tiny capillaries, and very importantly, it contains myosatellite cells.
What are those?
They're stem cells. They are absolutely vital for muscle repair and regeneration.
So when all 3 of those layers, the epi, peri, and endomysium come together at the end of the muscle, that's what attaches to the bone.
That's it. If it's a thick cord, we call it a tendon. If it's a big, flat sheet, that's an aponeuroses.
And for any of that to matter, it needs instructions. That happens at the neuromuscular synapse.
Yes, that's the communication hub. It's a specialized junction where a motor neuron's terminal meets the muscle fiber, the control point for every voluntary movement.
Let's zoom in even further then, because the microanatomy of a single muscle fiber is just wild. These cells are huge, sometimes up to 30 or 40 centimeters long.
Massive. And here's a really unique part. They're multinucleate. Hundreds of nuclei in one cell. That's because they were formed by fusing lots of smaller cells together during development.
Inside this giant cell, the membrane is the sarcolemma, and the cytoplasm is the sarcoplasm. Now, to get a signal across such a huge cell instantly, the sarcolemma has these deep tunnels that run into the cell They're called T-tubules.
Transverse tubules. They act like wiring, carrying the electrical impulse deep into the fiber all at once.
And the sarcoplasm is just jam-packed with thousands of these tiny cylindrical structures, the real workhorses, called myofibrils.
These are the things that actually do the shortening.
Right. And these myofibrils are organized into repeating units called sarcomeres. And because they're all lined up perfectly side by side, that's what gives skeletal muscle its striated, its banded look.
Those bands come from how the protein filaments, the myofilaments, are arranged. If we look at the proteins themselves, the thin filaments are mostly made of actin, and each actin molecule has an active site. But at rest, these sites are covered up by another protein, a chain called tropomyosin, which is held in place by a smaller protein, troponin.
So it's like a safety cover.
Exactly, a safety cover. And opposing them, you have the thick filaments. These are bundles of myosin molecules. Each one has a long tail and a mobile globular head, which we call a cross-bridge.
The cross-bridge. That sounds important.
It's the part that reaches out and grabs the thin filament, and this whole arrangement creates that visual pattern. The dark A-band, where you have thick filaments, and the light I-band, where you only have thin filaments.
You know, before we get into how they move, it's worth mentioning what happens when this whole system goes wrong. Our sources point to fibromyalgia. It's a neurosensory disorder characterized by chronic, widespread pain, fatigue, stiffness.
A really debilitating condition. And diagnosis is often based on finding a pattern of multiple tender points on the body. It's a major cause of musculoskeletal pain, especially in younger women.
Which brings us to the actual movement, the sliding filament theory.
This is the core mechanism, and the most important thing to remember is this. The filaments themselves don't shorten. They slide past each other, and that's what shortens the whole sarcomere.
So if we were watching this under a microscope, we'd see the light I bands and the H bands get smaller. The Z lines, they'd move closer together.
Right, but the width of the dark A band, which is the length of the thick myosin filaments, that would stay exactly the same. It doesn't change.
Okay, so walk me through the signal. It all starts with a neuron.
It does. Step 1. An electrical impulse arrives at that synaptic terminal. Step 2. The neuron releases a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, or A-sheet, into the gap.
And step 3.
A-sheet binds to receptors on the muscle fiber. That generates a brand new electrical signal, an action potential, that just sweeps down those T-tubules deep into the cell.
But the signal has to stop just as fast as it started for control.
Absolutely. There's an enzyme waiting right there in the gap called acetylcholinesterase, ACE. Its only job is to break down the ACA almost instantly. It ensures the signal is short and precise.
So once that impulse is rocketing down the T-tubules, we get to the main event, the contraction cycle.
Right. That electrical signal triggers the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is basically a calcium storage tank, to just release a flood of stored calcium ions into the sarcoplasm. This calcium, it's the ultimate biological switch.
And then what happens? What's the sequence of the pull?
Okay, so first, those calcium ions, they bind directly to troponin. Second, that binding makes troponin change shape, and it pulls the tropomyosin chain out of the way.
Uncovering the active sites on the actin. The safety cover is off.
Safety cover is off. So third, the myosin heads. The cross bridges, they immediately bind to those exposed active sites. Fourth, the myosin head pivots. It pulls the actin filament toward the center of the sarcomere. That's the power stroke.
But how does it let go to grab again?
That's step 5, and it's critical. A molecule of ATP has to bind to the myosin head. That binding is what causes the cross bridge to detach. Then the head uses that ATP's energy to reset, ready for the next cycle.
So the muscle stays contracted as long as there's calcium and ATP. Relaxation is just the reverse.
Essentially, yes. The nerve signal stops, the sarcoplasmic reticulum actively pumps all the calcium back into storage, the troponin-tropomyosin complex slides back over the active sites, and the pulling stops.
You know, that ATP detachment mechanism, it perfectly explains rigor mortis.
It does. After death, there's no more ATP being made. Calcium leaks out, the cross bridges form. But without ATP, the myosin heads can't detach. The muscles lock solid until enzymes start breaking them down hours later.
It's incredible. It shows that ATP's main job here is actually letting go, not pulling. It also means that the amount of tension a muscle can generate depends entirely on its starting position.
Exactly. You get maximum tension only at the optimal resting length. That's the sweet spot where the greatest number of cross bridges can possibly form. If the sarcomere is too short or stretched too far, tension just plummets.
And this incredible precision extends to how the nervous system controls whole muscles. It does that using motor units. What exactly is a motor unit?
A A motor unit is simply a single motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers it controls. The size of the unit dictates the precision of the movement.
So for eye muscles, you'd have, what, a few fibers per neuron?
A handful, yes, for fine control. But for gross movements, like in your leg muscles, a single neuron might control 2,000 fibers.
And each of those fibers follows the all or none principle, right?
Yeah.
It either contracts completely or not at all.
Correct. So to get more force out of the whole muscle, you need to use a mechanism called recruitment. You just steadily increase the number of active motor units.
What I find fascinating is the strategy the body uses to delay fatigue. It doesn't just fire the same motor units over and over.
No, that would be incredibly inefficient. It activates them on a rotating basis. Some units are working while others are resting and recovering. This allows for a smooth, sustained contraction without everything fatiguing at once.
And that rotational firing is what's responsible for muscle tone, even when we're not actively moving anything.
Yes, muscle tone is that baseline resting tension. It's maintained by this constant, random, low-level stimulation. It doesn't cause movement, but it keeps the joints stable. And if you repeatedly stimulate a muscle to near maximal tension,
Like with weightlifting.
you get hypertrophy. The muscle fibers actually get bigger, they produce more myofibrils, and the whole muscle gets stronger. The opposite, of course, is atrophy. No stimulation, and the fibers shrink and weaken.
We can also sort these fibers into different types based on how they generate that ATP.
Right, there's a trade-off between speed and endurance, which gives us three main types.
Let's start with the speed demons, fast fibers.
Or white fibers. They're large, they're packed with myofibrils, but they have very few mitochondria. They rely on anaerobic glycolysis, making ATP without oxygen. It's incredibly fast and powerful, but it produces lactic acid and they fatigue very, very quickly. Think of a sprinter.
And on the other end, you have the endurance champions, slow fibers.
Red fibers. They're smaller, they take longer to contract, but they are built for sustained activity. They use highly efficient aerobic metabolism. They're full of capillaries, mitochondria, and a protein called myoglobin, which stores oxygen. That's what makes them red. These are your marathon runners.
And I assume intermediate fibers are somewhere in the middle.
They are. They have properties of both. Faster than slow fibers, but much more fatigue resistant than fast fibers.
You know, this brings up another clinical point. Delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS. That feeling you get a day or two after a really hard workout.
Yes, and what's interesting there is that DOMS is often at its worst after eccentric contractions. That's when a muscle is lengthening while still resisting a load, like when you're slowly lowering a heavy weight. The exact cause is still debated. Is it tiny micro tears, inflammation? But it's clearly the body reacting to intense, unaccustomed stress.
Okay, let's pull back out to the macro level. The way the fascicles, those bundles of fibers, are arranged really determines what a muscle is good at.
Absolutely. The first pattern is parallel. The fascicles run parallel to the long axis, like in the biceps. These muscles can shorten the most, so they give you the biggest range of motion.
Then you have convergent muscles.
Where a broad muscle comes together at a single point, like the pectoralis in your chest. This makes them versatile. They can pull in one direction,
And the third type is pennate.
which means feather-like. The fascicles are at an angle to the tendon. Now, they don't shorten as much as a parallel muscle, but, and this is the key insight, a pennate muscle can pack in far more fibers. So for its size, it generates significantly more tension. It's a trade-off. Power over range.
And the last one.
Circular muscles, or sphincters, the fibers are arranged in a circle around an opening, like the muscle around your mouth. They guard entrances and exits.
So to really understand how all this creates movement, we have to think about our bodies as a system of levers.
We do. The bone is the lever, the joint is the fulcrum, or the pivot point. The muscle contraction is the applied force, and it moves the resistance, which is the load.
And there are different classes of levers.
3 classes, but the third class lever is by far the most common in the body. That's where the muscle's force is applied between the joint and the load. Now, mechanically, this is not great for raw strength.
So why is it so common?
Because it prioritizes speed and distance. You sacrifice some force, but you gain a huge advantage in how fast and how far you can move the end of the limb. It's an evolutionary trade-off for mobility, for running, for throwing.
That makes perfect sense. And the body has other tricks too, like anatomical pulleys.
Yes, these are bony structures that change the direction of a muscle's pull to make it more efficient. A perfect example is your patella, your kneecap. It redirects the force of your quadriceps tendon, which massively improves the leverage for extending your knee.
So let's bring this all home and talk about what happens to this incredible system as we age. Our sources lay out four main consequences.
First, muscle fibers just get smaller in diameter. You have fewer myofibrils, less ATP, less glycogen. This leads directly to reduced strength and endurance.
Second, muscles become less elastic.
That's due to a process called fibrosis. You get more fibrous connective tissue building up, which makes the muscles stiffer and can even restrict circulation.
Third, our tolerance for exercise goes down. We fatigue faster, and we're not as good at getting rid of the heat that muscle activity generates.
And fourth, and this is maybe the most critical for long-term health, our ability to recover from injury declines.
Because of those myosatellite cells.
Exactly. The population of those stem cells goes down with age. So when you get injured, your body has a harder time regenerating new muscle. You're more likely to just form scar tissue instead.
Wow. We've covered a huge amount of ground today. From the three connective tissue wrappings, to the sarcomere, to the sliding filament theory, motor units, fiber types, even livers.
We've seen how the whole system is built for this incredible range of tasks, from brute force to fine precision.
It's just astonishing to think all of this is happening right now every time you even reach for a cup of coffee.
It really is. And, since we know genetics plays a role in our fiber types and that aging brings this inevitable fibrosis and loss of those repair cells, it raises an important question for you to think about.
What's that?
Knowing what we know about hypertrophy from use and atrophy from disuse, what is the minimal amount of lifetime activity beyond just maintaining basic muscle tone that could effectively counteract that fibrosis and preserve enough of those myosatellite cells to keep a functional ability to recover from injury as we get older?
A compelling challenge to think about as you move through the rest of your day. Thank you for sharing your sources for this detailed deep dive. We'll catch you next time.